Okay, so you know that famous line from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad? Lead me from untruth to truth, from darkness to light, and from death to immortality. It's always stuck with me.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
Really gets you thinking, like, what is this truth we're all chasing after? And do these ancient texts, like the Vedas, actually show us the way? Or do they, throw some curveballs our way?
That's what we're going to try to figure out today. This deep dive is all about those big questions, and the Vedas are a perfect place to explore them. They're rich, complex, and full of surprises.
Right. And you've been asking to do an episode on the Vedas for a while now, haven't you? I know you're all about getting to the heart of these complex topics quickly but thoroughly, and I think we have just the source for that.
Let's hear it.
Professor N. Periyasamy's work, The Secrets of the Vedas.
Ah, okay. I've heard good things.
He's got this critical eye, He doesn't just accept the Vedas on face value. He really digs into the less talked about parts, the stuff that makes you think. Plus, we'll be looking at other ancient Indian philosophies that went against the Vedic grain, like full-on disagreed with them. Should be interesting.
Totally. So we're aiming to unpack all these layers, right? The
Yeah.
nuances, the contradictions, all the good stuff Periyasamy brings up.
Exactly. It's not just about praising the Vedas. It's about understanding them in their historical context.
Right, getting the full picture.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are the Vedas in the first place? I mean, we hear the term all the time, but what's at the core of it?
So Veda, it basically comes from the Sanskrit root vid, which means to know. It's all about knowledge, right, from the name itself. And the way this knowledge was passed down gets really interesting with these two concepts, sruti and smriti.
Sruti. Smriti. Those sound super important. What do they mean?
They're crucial. Sruti literally means that which is heard. Think of it like this. The Vedas were originally an oral tradition, passed down for generations, carefully recited, not written down at first.
So like an ancient game of telephone, but with really high stakes.
Kind of. And because of this oral tradition, they're considered aparushya, not authored by humans. They were heard by these ancient seers, like a divine revelation.
Wow, that's a powerful origin story. But there's this huge body of knowledge, right? So is everyone on the same page about what actually counts as the Veda proper?
Well, that's where things get a bit messy. Even someone like Swami Vivekananda recognized that there are different opinions among scholars. He said some people believe the whole shebang, the Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads all came straight from Brahman, the ultimate reality. But then you have someone like Swami Dayananda Sarasvati, who is adamant that only the Samhitas, the collections of hymns and verses, are the real deal, the original Vedas. Everything else he thought was added later, like interpretations and whatnot.
So it's like the original text versus all the commentaries that came after. Can you give us a quick rundown of what's in each of these four sections?
Sure. The Samhitas are basically your hymns and prayers, mostly addressed to different Vedic gods. Then you have the Brahmanas. These are prose texts that really dive into the nitty-gritty of the rituals and sacrifices. They explain all the details, the symbolism, the philosophy behind them. And then you have the Aranyakas, which means forest treatises. These were written by sages living in the forest, and they get a bit more symbolic and philosophical. It's like they were moving away from the strict rituals and trying to understand the deeper meaning behind them.
Okay, so it's getting more abstract as we go.
Exactly. And finally, you have the Upanishads. These are also known as Vedanta, which means the end or culmination of the Vedas. And they're all about deep philosophy, the nature of reality, the self, Atman, the connection between us and the universe, Brahman. It's like the peak of Vedic thought, moving from rituals to big questions about existence.
So it's like a journey, starting with hymns and rituals and ending with these deep philosophical explorations.
Exactly, a gradual unfolding of understanding, you could say.
And Max Muller, that famous scholar, he was really impressed by the Vedas, wasn't he?
Oh, he was a huge fan. He even said, I maintain that for a study of man, there is nothing in the world equal in importance with the Veda. To everybody who cares for himself, for his ancestors, for his history, or for his intellectual development, a study of Vedic literature is indispensable. He thought they were absolutely essential for understanding, well, basically everything about humanity.
That's a pretty strong endorsement.
Yeah.
So we have these four layers, Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. But then we also have the four Vedas themselves, Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva. How do those fit in?
Okay, good question. So the four Vedas are basically the main samhitas, the core collections of hymns. The Rig Veda is the oldest and the biggest one, mostly hymns praising different gods. The Yajur Veda is more focused on the rituals, like the specific words and formulas used in ceremonies. It actually borrows a lot from the Rig Veda and adapts those hymns for ritual purposes. The Samaveda is all about melodies and chants, also mostly from the Rig Veda, but arranged for singing during sacrifices and other sacred events.
And the Atharva Veda, Professor Periyasamy says it's kind of a late bloomer compared to the others.
Right. The first three, Rig, Yajur, and Sama, they were known as the Treyi, which means triple Vidya. That was considered the core Vedic knowledge in earlier times. The Atharva Veda, which actually has more unique hymns than the others, plus spells, incantations, and even philosophical stuff you don't find in the other three, was kind of added to the club later on. So while the Rig Veda lays a lot of the groundwork, the Atharva Veda offers this different, sometimes even contrasting perspective on life and spirituality.
Interesting. And I remember Swami Vivekananda had this really broad definition of Veda, didn't he? He wasn't limiting it to just these specific texts.
Totally. He famously said, all that is true is Veda. Super open-minded, right? He basically said that even philosophies that seemed non-Vedic, like Buddhism and Jainism, could be considered part of the broader Hindu tradition if they had truth in them. He even saw Buddha as a Vedantist, in a way, even though historically there was a lot of tension between early Buddhism and the Vedic practices, especially the animal sacrifices, which Buddha was really against.
So like a philosophical Venn diagram with some overlap, but also some real conflict.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of nuance there.
Now, speaking of different perspectives, Periyasamy brings up this idea of henotheism, which Max Miller used to describe Hindu worship. What's that all about?
Henotheism, it's basically worshiping one god at a time, but still acknowledging that other gods exist. Like a middle ground between monotheism, where there's only one god, and polytheism, where there are many. And it fits really well with the Vedic idea that ekam sat, vipra bahuta vadanti. The truth is one, sages call it by various names. There's this underlying unity in the divine, but it can be experienced and worshipped in so many different ways.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And Professor Periyasamy gives examples from Manikavasagar and Vaishnavite traditions. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
Sure. Manikavasagar, he was this amazing Tamil Shaivite saint, a devotee of Shiva. He said something beautiful in his hymns, essentially saying that the divine has no one form, no one name, but we call it by so many names. And this idea of one ultimate reality taking on all these different forms and names, it pops up all over Hinduism, including in Vaishnavism, which focuses on Vishnu and his avatars.
So it's like a built-in flexibility, a way to see the divine in so many ways. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Periyasamy says there were actually a bunch of philosophical schools in ancient India that disagreed with the Vedas. Kind of surprising, considering how revered they are, right?
Right. You wouldn't necessarily expect that.
So who are these dissenters? Give us the rundown.
Well, K. Varadarjan, this Marxist commentator, he listed 9 major schools of Indian philosophy. And while some of them, like Mimamsa, Samkhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Yoga, they more or less accepted the Vedas in some way, others were like, nope, not for us. Lokayata, Jainism, and Buddhism were the big dissenters. And even within the Vedic tradition itself, you have later schools of Vedanta like Advaita, Dvaita, and Vishishtadvaita developed by these super influential thinkers like Adi Shankara, Madhava, and Ramanujacharya. And they all had their own, sometimes very different interpretations of the Vedas.
So it's not even a simple yes or no on the Vedas. There's a whole spectrum of acceptance and rejection, even in ancient times.
Absolutely, a whole spectrum of opinions, which is pretty cool when you think about it. What's really interesting is that, unlike some other ancient religious texts, the Vedas seem to actually allow for dissent about the existence of God.
Now that's remarkable. It's like they were open to different viewpoints.
Totally. And it shows how intellectually vibrant and relatively open ancient India was. You find agnosticism, atheism, materialism, all sorts of ideas being debated. And the Lokayata school, that's the materialistic one, they were a particularly strong voice against the Vedic establishment.
Lokayata. Okay, so Periyasamy says they were one of the first, maybe even the first, materialist philosophy. Tell me more about this school of thought. What were their main ideas?
So Lokayata is associated with this guy named Sarvaka, sometimes called Karvaka Maharishi. And the name Lokayata itself had a couple of meanings. It could mean prevalent among the people, suggesting it was a philosophy for the everyday person. Or it could mean of this world, emphasizing its focus on the material reality, the stuff we can actually see and experience. There was even a Tamil Siddhas named Lokayatar, which is interesting. It shows how these materialist ideas resonated in different parts of ancient India.
It sounds very grounded, very focused on the here and now. But the paper says most of the original Lokayata texts have been destroyed. It's going to be frustrating for scholars.
It is. It's a huge loss. We mostly know about them from what their opponents wrote, and you know how that goes. They probably twisted Lokayata ideas to make them easier to attack. Imagine trying to understand one side of a debate only from what the other side says. The historian Debi Prasad Chattopadhyay was really bummed about this. He said it's ironic that we have to rely on these snarky commentaries to piece together Lokayata's original teachings.
Kind of like a historical puzzle with missing pieces.
Exactly. But here's something interesting. Kautilya, in his Arthasastra, which is like a guide to statecraft, he actually said that a king should study Lokayata.
Really, why would a ruler need to know about a materialistic philosophy? That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's pretty intriguing. It suggests that even a king had to be aware of different ways of seeing the world, even those that challenged religion and social norms. Maybe Kautilya saw the value in their emphasis on logic and observation, or maybe he knew it was important to understand the beliefs of the common people, you know, since Lokayata is associated with that.
So maybe like a tool to understand and govern the people better.
Could be. And then you have Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, who actually had a pretty positive view of Lokayata. He saw it as this rebellion against Vedic superstitions and social injustice.
That's a pretty modern take.
It is. Nehru saw them as this intellectual force that stood up against the inequalities that he felt were perpetuated by certain interpretations of the Vedas and the ruling class. He compared them to thinkers like Ingersoll, Bradley, and Periyar, who all challenged authority and even the idea of God. And there's even this Puranic myth that says Brihaspati, who's like the teacher of the gods, was the one who started Lokayata. So their history is pretty tangled and fascinating.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So clearly a powerful force, even if we don't have all their original writings. But the paper then talks about historical conflicts and suppression. It's like there was a darker side to all this intellectual debate.
Right. It wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Periyasamy talks about Rajaram Mohan Roy, a key figure in the Indian Renaissance. He was really into Hindu philosophy, but he also challenged some established Vedic practices, like sati, the practice of widows burning themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. He was adamantly against it, even though it was rooted in certain religious interpretations.
He was a reformer in many ways, and his stance on education was really interesting too. He initially said, Sanskrit is the language of the gods, but he later changed his view. He became more focused on modern secular education, even saying English ever, Sanskrit never. It was like he was questioning the dominance of traditional Vedic learning.
A shift in priorities towards more modern world.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just in later periods that these dissenting ideas were suppressed. There's that thing with Dr. S. Radhakrishnan's criticism of Lokayata and how they were portrayed in the historical drama Prapoda Chandrodayam.
Right. Even someone like Dr. Radhakrishnan, in some of his early work, he took a pretty critical view of Lokayata, basing it on this play by Krishna Mishra. The play is basically an allegory, and it paints Lokayatas, along with Buddhists and Jains, as these morally corrupt, disruptive elements in society. And while later thinkers like Osho offered more balanced perspectives on Lokayata, it's clear that there was a trend of putting them down in certain orthodox circles.
It's especially disturbing to read about actual persecution, like that story from the Mahabharata where the Lokayata guru Karavaka is burned to death for speaking his mind to Yudhishthira. It's like Giordano Bruno in Europe being punished for challenging dogma.
Yeah, it's a pretty dark parallel. In the Mahabharata, Karvaka basically grills Yudhishthira about the consequences of the war, and for that, he's branded a heretic and killed by Brahmins. It really shows how much intolerance there was for ideas that went against the grain, even back then.
And the Ramayana story with Jabali, the Lokayata scholar who advises Rama against doing all these Brahminical rituals, that really highlights the clash between rationalism and traditional religion.
Absolutely. Jabali basically says these rituals are useless, that they only benefit the priests who perform them. It's a classic Lokayata critique of Vedic practices. And even though Rama ends up sticking to tradition, the fact that Jabali's dissenting view is even included in the epic is significant.
It's like they couldn't completely ignore these dissenting voices, even if they didn't agree with them.
Exactly. And there's also Ajita Kesakambali, who lived around Buddha's time, who went even further in rejecting Vedic ideas. He denied the existence of gods, heaven, hell, the whole shebang. Lokayata really was a voice for the common person, questioning the authority of the Vedic tradition and the Brahmin caste, and even the whole caste system itself.
That leads perfectly into questioning Vedic values. Periyasamy tells this story about King Janaka, who's busy with Vedic introspection while his city burns. He even compares him to Nero.
Ouch, that's a harsh comparison. But Subramania Frathiyar, who told that anecdote, he he's making a serious point. He's saying that obsessing over philosophy can make you blind to real-world problems and suffering. It's a question of balance between personal spiritual stuff and your responsibilities to others.
And then there's that famous conversation between Yajnavalkya and Maitreya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad about love. They
Yeah.
say that loving others comes from self-love, from the Atman. But Surya K. Viramani, in his work Gita and Madhupakam, he's not buying it.
Right. Viramani was a big figure in the Dravidian movement, and he's saying that this kind of self-centered love, where it's all about the Atman, can actually be a problem. He says it might make people less empathetic, less genuinely caring for others, like it reduces love to a form of self-interest.
It's an interesting ethical dilemma, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
how do we understand love and compassion in the context of these ancient ideas?
Right. Makes you think.
Okay, let's talk about scriptures and access now. Swami Chittapavananda is totally right when he says that scriptures are super important for preserving religious traditions. That's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, writing stuff down ensures that teachings don't get lost or distorted over time. And the Rig Veda, it's actually the first well-documented text in Sanskrit, which is pretty cool from a linguistic perspective.
But, and this is a big but, not everyone was allowed to access these scriptures, were they? The paper talks about how certain groups were excluded from studying or even hearing the Vedas.
That's a major issue. For centuries, Vedic knowledge was basically a Brahmin thing. Sudras, Panchamas, and even women, they were all shut out. Imagine that a whole chunk of society denied access to these supposedly sacred texts. And it gets worse. If a Shudra was caught listening to the Vedas, they could be severely punished. Not very inclusive, right?
No, not at all. It seems totally at odds with the idea of these texts being a source of wisdom for all. It wasn't until the 11th century that Ramanuja tried to share some of the Vedic teachings with lower castes. He even called the Panchamas Thirukulathar, which was a sign of respect.
It was a big step, for sure, even if it was a small one in the grand scheme of things. And then later on, you have Western scholars like Colebrook, Max Muller, Wilson, and Griffith, who translated the Vedas into English, which opened them up to a much wider audience. And then you have Indian thinkers like Rahul Sankirtayan, Didi Kosambi, S.A. Dange, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyaya, and Professor S. Vayapuri, who interpreted them from a more common person's point of view, challenging the traditional Brahminical interpretations.
That's great. It's like democratizing knowledge, making it accessible to more people. Okay, this next part really blew my mind. The shifting pantheon and changing meanings. It turns out the big gods in the Rig Veda aren't even the main gods in Hinduism today.
All right, it's wild how things change over time. You have these prominent Rigvedic gods like Indra, Agni, Soma, Varuna. They're all over those early hymns. But they're not the top dogs anymore in modern Hindu worship.
So who took their place?
Well, gods who were considered less important in the Vedic period, like the Devadasa Adityas and Ekadasa Rudras, they kind of merged with local deities and evolved into the big figures we know today, Vishnu and Shiva. And a lot of the gods and goddesses we see in Hinduism today, they became popular after the Vedic period.
So it's like a constant evolution of beliefs.
Exactly. Always adapting, changing, reinterpreting. And get this, Ganapati, or Vinayaka, the one who removes obstacles, he was actually considered a demon in some old texts. Yajnavalkya even associated him with lower castes. Total flip from how we see him today.
That's a huge change in status.
Right. And it's not just the gods. The meanings of key Vedic words like Brahma Brahman, Gautram, and Isvara, they've all shifted over the centuries. Gautram, for example, used to mean a cowshed or a group of people descended from the same ancestor. Now it's mostly used for Brahmin lineages. And what's really interesting is that you won't find the elaborate stories and images we associate with many Hindu gods in the oldest Vedas. They came much later.
It's like the Vedas laid the foundation, and then everything else was built on top of it, changing and evolving along the way. Now let's talk about some of the controversies within the Vedas themselves. Professor Periyasamy mentions how Agni, the fire god, is invoked as the bride's secret lover during wedding ceremonies. That's a bit unexpected, to say the least.
It is pretty strange, isn't it? And he points out that if people knew what those old marriage mantras really meant, they might find them a bit problematic today. Another thing that's different from modern Hinduism is the view on vegetarianism. In the Vedas, Brahmins are shown eating meat and performing animal sacrifices all the time. There's even the Asvamedha Yaga, the horse sacrifice, and the Purusha Meda Yagna, which some scholars believe refers to a human sacrifice, though that's debated. It shows how much ideas about food and ethics have changed within the same religious tradition.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. And then there's that crazy story about R.T.H. Griffith, who translated the Rig Veda. He refused to translate some verses because he thought they were too obscene. He even mentions one involving a queen and well, let's just say the anatomy of a sacrificed horse. Pretty shocking stuff.
Yeah. Griffith had his limits, I guess, although Swami Dayananda Sarasvati later said those verses were probably added later and weren't part of the original text. But the fact that they're there at all in the version of the Rig Veda we have today, it raises some tough questions about social norms and rituals in that era.
It definitely makes you think. Okay, last but not least, we have to talk about the roots of the caste system. The paper argues that while the caste system as we know it was codified later, its origins can be traced back to the Vedas themselves. That's a pretty big deal, right?
Definitely a sensitive topic. But that's the argument Periyasamy makes. The most well-known reference is the Purusha Sukta hymn in the Rig Veda. It describes the four Varnas Brahmin, Rajanya, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra as coming from different parts of the body of this primordial being called Purusha. And then you have the Samameda and the Chandogya Upanishad, which connect Varna to karma from past lives. Good deeds get you born into a higher caste, bad deeds into a lower one, even as an animal or someone outside the caste system altogether.
So basically, the Vedas provided the seeds for the caste system, which then grew into this rigid and unequal system in later texts like the Dharmashastras and Manusmriti.
Exactly. However symbolic those early Vedic ideas may have been, they were used to justify social hierarchy and discrimination.
Wow, this deep dive has been a real roller coaster, hasn't it? We've explored the origins and complexities of the Vedas, the dissenting voices that challenged them, the evolution of gods and meanings, and some pretty controversial stuff like violence and the caste system. It's clear that the Vedas are way more than just some ancient holy books. They're a reflection of the human search for truth in all its messiness and contradictions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's a search that continues to this day. Our source material ends with a powerful quote from the Veda itself. Asadoma Satgamaya, lead me from falsehood to truth.
That's a perfect note to end on. After this exploration, I'm really left wondering, what untruths are we still clinging to? What do we need to examine more closely in our own understanding of history, tradition, and even ourselves? It's a question we should all be asking. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring. There's always more to learn.